Okay, I'd like to welcome the listening audience to session E1, the SDGs as a contributor to racial justice and reformation of transformative politics. But before we get started, I'd like to thank the organizers, beginning with President Frederick of Howard University, Provost Wuta, and our chief organizers, Dean Dana Williams of the Graduate School, and Dean Holly Walker of the Law School. So we're going to get started. I'm going to introduce the guests by reading up their bios. You'll give us just a second here. I'll introduce Professor Carlton Waterhouse, who will be speaking to you first. He's an international expert on environmental law and environmental justice, as well as reparations and redress for historic injustices. He is the founding director of the Environmental Justice Center at the Howard University School of Law. He is a Fulbright Research Scholar and is a board member of the Environmental Law Institute. His views have been published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other media outlets. He is a highly sought after speaker who regularly addresses national and international audiences. His forthcoming book with Cambridge University Press explores the historic and contemporary roles of the United States Supreme Court in maintaining a racial hierarchy. I'll read the bio of our remaining panelists that will be upcoming after Professor Waterhouse. Dr. Jeffrey Sachs is a university professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he directed the Earth Institute from 2002 until 2016. He is also director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and a commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development. He has been advisor to 3 United Nations Secretary Generals and currently serves as an SDG advocate under Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He spent over 20 years as a professor at Harvard University, where he received his BA, MA, and PhD degrees. He has authored numerous bestseller books. His most recent book is A New Foreign Policy, Beyond American Exceptionalism. Sachs was twice named as Time Magazine's 100 most influential world leaders and was ranked by The Economist among the top 3 most influential living economists. I'm going to read you the bio of our third esteemed panelist. Mr. Earl W. Hamilton is the Chief Operations Officer of the National Center for Faith-Based Initiatives. Mr. Hamilton is a strategist recognized nationally for providing innovative program design, capacity building, policy, and advocacy to projects that are rooted in empirical data and established best practices. During the course of his career, he has leveraged hundreds of millions of public and private sector funding to create infill housing and wraparound supports in distressed urban communities. He has designed and facilitated technical assistance programs, provided capacity training, and administered grant funding to more than 15,000 faith and community-based organizations throughout the United States. Prior to his work in the nonprofit sector, Mr. Hamilton began his career in the banking industry as a commercial lender with a specialty in mergers and acquisitions, holding executive positions at Textron Financial Corporation and Bank Atlantic. In addition to advising and providing lending for mid to large corporations, he opened and managed the regional corporate offices in Southeast Florida. Mr. Hamilton received a bachelor's degree in business finance and management with a minor in mechanical engineering from Florida Atlantic University. Mr. Hamilton has received numerous accolades, including being named to 2015 Washington's top association and nonprofit CFOs list by trending40.com. Let's give a hearty welcome to our first panelist today, Professor Carlton. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bond. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all on this afternoon and to be in such a momentous homecoming celebration as we have moved to maximizing our online capacities to bring people together across time and space. And so we're in the midst of an epidemic, but we also are learning new things about how to communicate and how to work together. And so we're grateful for those things. I'm honored to be on a panel with such esteemed panelists as Professor Sachs and Mr. Hamilton and our moderator, Dr. Bond. I'm going to take a few moments out this afternoon to share with you all an idea that I have kind of been fleshing through about unsustainable environmentalism and why justice matters. So to begin that discussion, I want to hearken us back to earlier days in our movement globally to achieve greater levels of environmental protection, to the creation of our common future, also known as the Brundtland Report. And the Brundtland Report made a determination very early on in the environmental movement that a world in which poverty and inequity are endemic will always be prone to ecological and other crises. And this is a really important principle that I think in the United States in particular is under considered and under illustrated and under exemplified, right? Environmental protection without equity is itself unsustainable. But in the United States context, we talk a lot about sustainability without ever really thinking or doing or talking even a lot about equity as a central feature of sustainability. So in considering this role of equity in my talk today, I'm going to focus my attention on the United States. But the issues that I'm referring to really are not unique to the United States. They really apply globally. And they apply globally in the sense that equity has not sufficiently been fleshed out in the way we think about environmental protection. So let's start off as we're talking about in this conference today, or in this panel today, we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, right? The 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And I want to focus on what we get from the Sustainable Development Goals as they are, right? One, the Sustainable Development Goals properly emphasize and promote the elevation of human welfare, and also the decreased decreased inequality in world societies, right? And specifically, as we break out the individual SDGs, we can see they talk about 1, poverty alleviation, 2, zero hunger, 3, good health, 4, quality education, 6, access to water and sanitation for all, and 8, decent work and economic growth. So all of these are explicit SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, that we as a world are to be working together to accomplish over the next few decades. But in addition to the idea of improving human welfare, as we see in these earlier SDGs, the second bullet talks about the idea of equality. And so we see gender equality emphasized in the 5th SDG. We see reduced inequality within and among countries in SDG 10, and we see peace, justice, and strong institutions emphasized in SDG 16. So there is a discussion and an attentiveness to, right, not only raising the floor in terms of how people's lives are lived and the quality of their life, but also we see attentiveness to how close together people are brought in terms of their experiences in the world, and gender equality, reduced inequality otherwise, and justice, right, and strong institutions as well as peace are emphasized. Further, we see that the SDGs have equity targets that condemn specific laws and practices that are discriminatory, right? So under the gender equality targets, we see that ensure women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels of decision-making are called for. We see that reduced inequality by 2030 would lead to empowering the promotion of social, economic, and political inclusion, irrespective of age, sex, disability, race, ethnicity, origin, religion, or economic or other status. We see further at 10.3 that target that we should ensure equal opportunity and reduce inequalities of outcomes, including the elimination of discriminatory laws, policies, and practices, and promoting appropriate legislation, policies, and action. That's a really important one. I want you to just kind of get a grip on and think about and kind of put in your pocket for discussion later. And then lastly, as we get to goal 16 and a couple of targets at 16.7, ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. Another one to put in your pocket. And then lastly, promote and enforce non-discriminatory laws and policies for sustainable development. And I asked you to put those in your pockets because those are important goals that go towards my point in this talk today. And that is that a lot of the goals go towards kind of the alleviation of human misery in terms of access to water and sanitation, elimination of poverty, elimination of hunger, for example. But I want to say that our discussion and attention and focus on the SDGs need more attention to injustice, right? We need more attention to injustice. Now, those two in your pockets give you tools for us to think about, right, under SDG 10 and SDG 16, injustice in particular and how we can fight it. But really, they kind of stand out. They are more the rule, the exception rather than the rule, and they aren't always lifted up in these conversations. And it's very important that that happen because in an environmental context, beyond the idea that some people have more food and some people have more wealth and that some people, for example, have cleaner access to water and sanitation, we also have environmental disparities, right? And environmental disparities are not really explicitly kind of engaged in the discussions of the SDGs in many communities, globally and domestically. And these disparities that exist, I'm going to talk about right now in the context of the United States. And these environmental disparities are disparities that kind of relate to a group identity. And in the United States context, we're talking specifically about racial identity. So we can see, and I'm going to go through a number of slides, a number of statistics here that are important, and I'm going to go through fairly quickly through them. So I'm going to beg your indulgence to kind of stick with me. But we see how, irrespective of kind of where you are relative to poverty, your group membership, right, based on a racial identity or indigeneity in the United States means that you're going to have a disproportionate likelihood of being exposed to pollutants. And that's not something that is as explicitly kind of addressed in the SDGs. And that is what's related to what we call environmental justice in the United States, which is the movement to eliminate these kinds of racial disparities. So, for example, right, we'll see that with regards to NO2, that even though people's poverty level increased the level of concentrations that they were likely to be exposed to in NO2, which is a regulated air pollutant, they were 7% higher for those who were not in poverty, for those who were in poverty. But when it comes to racial identity, we actually see that the concentrations of NO2 are 37% higher, right, for people of color than they are for whites, right? So we can see that poverty matters, but if we're just going to eliminate poverty, we're going to eliminate hunger, even if we give everybody access to water and sanitation, that still would not address the disparity that we're seeing in exposure to these air pollutants, which are harmful, right? We see, for example, lower income whites, higher exposure than high income Latinos to NO2. And what difference does NO2 make? Well, it causes asthma and other respiratory diseases as well as heart disease. and accounts for 7,000 additional deaths every year in communities of color. What else about air pollution could be relevant for us in terms of understanding racial disparities? Well, asthma is a very important one. And we see that, in fact, the asthma rates for African-American children are much higher. In fact, African-American children are twice as likely to have asthma and increased asthma attacks and deaths. And what difference does that make? Well, the air pollution that you're exposed to not only triggers asthma, but the Children's Health Study showed in California over a long longitudinal study that the air pollutant exposure actually contributes to creating asthma and lung disease more broadly. So what about other pollutants? Well, with regards to ozone, we know African Americans are more likely to live in counties with the worst ozone pollution, and as a result have all kinds of ailments that flow from that, like increased lower birth weight in children, as well as decreased lung function in newborns as well. We also know that short and long-term exposure to ozone is likely to cause early death, cardiovascular harm, congestive heart failure, right? What else? Well, particulate matter, right? This is fine particulates at 2.5 micrometers or less. We know that if you're in poverty, you're 1.35 times, have a 1.35 times higher burden than the rest of the population. So we see that poverty matters, and that people of color broadly had a 1.28 times higher burden of particulate matters. But we see in the United States that African Americans are have a 1.5 times higher burden than the rest of the population in terms of their exposure to particulate matters. And so we see this is not only a national phenomenon, but it also tends to hold across most states and counties. Now, what difference does that make? Well, we actually see that these disparities that exist are more stark than disparities based on poverty. And what does that tell us? That tells us that a strict focus on poverty elimination is not sufficient to deal with the environmental inequities that exist in American society. Further, we found that the condition isn't necessarily getting better. We often think that as time goes on, obviously we're making progress supposedly and things get better. But in fact, we found that from 1999 to 2011, over that roughly 12-year period, we found that Black children's asthma rates actually increased relative to their white counterparts, and that even though your socioeconomic status was associated with it, we found that racial differences were even present after we accounted for differences in income and education. Racial differences persisted. So the last thing I'll talk about is a long-running disparity in our environmental experiences in the United States for African American children and lead. And this has been an ongoing problem that's well known, well researched over the last 70 years, and yet the disparities that exist for African American children relative to their white counterparts continue almost unabated. So why is that important? That's important because if we're going to get to the heart of dealing with sustainability, we've got to deal with equity. And if we're going to deal with equity, we can't only attend to the problems of poverty, but we need to see how group-based differences in the United States and globally actually says something about people's life experiences and life chances, and in particular, their exposure to pollution and the harms that it produces. Now, how did we come to be in this situation in the United States? This is a result of white supremacy, right? A history of white supremacy in the United States. And when I say white supremacy, I don't mean necessarily Ku Klux Klan kind of membership white supremacy, burning crosses white supremacy, although that's certainly a part of the history. But I'm talking about white supremacy that is enmeshed in government policies, government practices, and the law. So we see here, for example, when the Federal Housing Administration kicked off its program in 1934 to increase housing for all Americans, what they did was they instantiated and institutionalized a racist practice of denying opportunities for obtaining loans to people of color, particularly for African Americans. And so in doing so, what they did was they said, oh, we're going to provide a subsidy to banks or a protection to banks who are going to lend out money for people to get mortgages. And you can read about this in Robert Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. And so when you think about this, what they're saying basically is that, oh, if a bank wants to give out a mortgage to a homeowner on very good terms, like a 30-year mortgage and only 10% down, the kind of terms that we expect in our mortgages today, then the federal government say, we will in fact guarantee the loan. So if they default, we will go ahead and pay you for that default. But in doing so, the federal government also said, but you need to follow our guidelines in deciding who you lend to. And those guidelines specifically decided and included, I should say, the drawing of lines in the United States, in our American cities, to say what neighborhoods would be worthy of loans and what neighborhoods would not be worthy of loans. And neighborhoods that were not worthy of loans received a red border around them, hence the term redlining. And those were neighborhoods that were made up of African Americans and other communities of color. And those were also neighborhoods that might be mixed. So if there was an integrated neighborhood, it got redlined, thus encouraging people to engage in racial segregation and encouraging banks to engage in racial discrimination. So what causes the kind of environmental inequities that we just talked about? Well, as I was just saying, for example, with the Federal Housing Administration policy, these are caused by past and ongoing institutional practices that favor some groups over the other. And so in American context, that mostly means a result of racial discrimination and class-based discrimination. And so we have the white supremacy of the Ku Klux Klan that is involved in America, but that is not the kind of structural discrimination that is the primary basis of these experiences of inequity and inequality that we face. In fact, we can find that the United States laws and policies, rather than a breakout group like the Ku Klux Klan, has been one that has established a bias towards white supremacy in the American context. And I won't have time to go through all of these, but all of these were very racialized policies that led to the creation of a racial hierarchy in the American society across a period of centuries. And so the use of law and the use of federal policy and the use of state policy and the use of policies at the county level and the local level, as well as laws, largely has guided how people's group identity has impacted their life experiences. And that flows directly into their exposure to environmental pollutants. Further, though, in the more recent times, we see that there continue to be policies and practices of racial discrimination in the political sphere, in the economic sphere, that also furthered group-based disparities. And I'll just pull out one that I think is very relevant, which is the idea of sundown towns, which you can read about in James Lowen's book by the same name. And in it, he categorizes all the different ways that towns became racially exclusive. In other words, white towns excluded people of color and explicitly African Americans as well as Latinos in some cases. And in doing so, what they did was they either passed ordinances or they posted signs or they engaged in a lynching, or they, as they did in Tulsa, literally ran people out of town after engaging in violence and destruction. Of course, we know about racial segregation as a basic matter and the creation of white-only spaces. So sundown towns were the creation of white-only living spaces, and they were called sundown towns because African Americans and others were allowed to be in those spaces to work, but they weren't allowed to be in those spaces to live. They were excluded. And so violence was, and the law enforcement officials were often the enforcers. Some of these towns had signs that said, using derogatory language, be out by sundown, don't get caught in this town. If persons were, they could expect that they would suffer violence or an arrest or both. So we see, this is a picture from Tulsa. We all know about the folks running African Americans out of Greenwood after destroying, burning that neighborhood to the ground. And we've just talked about the Federal Housing Administration, but most people don't know that the idea of mob violence as a way of carrying out and continuing racial hierarchy and subordination of people of color was a common phenomenon in the United States. And we have several major incidents that occurred between 1900 and 1846. They're called race riots, but in all of these cases, these are examples where white neighborhoods and mobs attacked African American communities. And so when you think about the Federal Housing Administration program that I mentioned earlier, here's a map that you can take a look and you can literally see this idea of what was red-lined, that was yellow-lined, and then blue and green-lined. And of course, all of the green spaces were exclusively white areas, and the blue spaces as well. And any space that was integrated or that was a black area was considered red and hazardous. As a result, we know that banks and mortgage companies were discouraged from lending to people of color because they wouldn't get a guarantee on the loan if the persons defaulted. As a result, the terms that they made available for people of color to get mortgages were not favorable as the terms were that were being made for whites. And this policy continued all the way up until the late 1960s in the passage of the Fair Housing Act and Title VIII in 1968. So if you're interested in seeing more, you can go to this link, in fact, and you can see a series of maps around the United States that will show all of the redlining that took place in our major cities. So what's important about this in the time that I have remaining? So in the time I have remaining, I want to explain that all of these phenomena that I'm referring to are social phenomena. They are not a matter of just random acts. They're not a matter of just individual racial discrimination. And that's important because people only understand group-based discrimination as being when one individual member of a group makes a decision that they don't like or they want to harm another member of a group. It's a great way to keep group-based discrimination in place. But what we see in all of these cases is that these were in fact social phenomena, right? They were based on laws, economic policies, and political decisions, right? So conquest, slavery, segregation, exclusions on ownership against women, exclusions of education for women, exclusion of political rights from women. All of these were legal, economic, and political decisions, not just the result of an individual who had animus or bias, but structures that were put in place to maintain a hierarchy in favor of whites and men, and white men in particular. So to understand how we can best address these structural related problems that groups face across societies, I use social dominance theory to help us see how across societies, and in the United States in particular, group-based dominance continues to play itself out and continues to maintain a disparate distribution of environmental harms and goods. And so the theory basically argues that people in societies organize themselves within groups, and certain groups tend to dominate within those societies. And so So there are three types of dominance that you might think about as you think about the theory. One would be age, the old dominate the young. One would be gender, in that men have dominated over women. And the third, the arbitrary set dominance, can be different things in different places. So you might want to think about Northern Ireland and religion. You might want to think about Rwanda and tribal differences. You might want to think about South Africa and race. You think about the United States and race. But you can also think about indigenous people globally. You can think about the Roma people in Germany and in France. And so there are many different types of group identities that can be the result or that can be the basis of discrimination. And that's what we call arbitrary set. And in the United States context, from which I'll take most of the rest of my remarks, that is a set that I'm focusing on around race. But of course, as I've already said, all of these different things can relate to a variety of different factors, including ethnicity, as well as religion. And so an intersectionality recognizes that individuals really have multiple identities that they share. And so that means based on whether your identity is favored or disfavored in a society where you find yourself, you can find yourself at the very top of the social hierarchy in that society or at the very bottom, because your intersection of identity, perhaps being disabled, being a woman, being a person of color, being a person who was not native born or a citizen, all of those things combine to produce a disadvantage in the social structures of that society. And that is a reflection of the way that subordination and dominance function. And so in the United States context, we might think about white racial dominance as a major part of the narrative of American history that has influenced everything from wealth to employment to education to housing to opportunities for executive offices for everyone other than whites. And so dominance has an environmental component to it, right? There's a very deep and strong and powerful environmental component to dominance. And that environmental component means that there are benefits to being part of the dominant group, right? Having access to clean green spaces and clean water, having clean soils in your neighborhoods, and having a higher resistance to natural disasters and greater control over the decision-making about what happens in your community and in the government. But there are costs to being part of a subordinated group, right? Which means like you have higher risk and lower resilience to natural disasters, that you have less access to drinking water that's clean and surface and soil water that are clean, surface water and soils that are clean. And you have a higher proximity or closer proximity to waste facilities and increased levels of pollution where you work and where you live and where you play, and you experience increased morbidity and disease. So we might think about Hurricane Katrina. We might think about the Flint water crisis. We can think about all of those fence-lined communities where people of color live and work and play, right? So how does dominance work? In the remaining time I have left, I'll explain that it works in three primary ways. One is based on the ideas and beliefs the society holds. One is based on the way institutions function, and the other is based on the individual preferences of members of institutions. And so in the environmental context, we might want to think about the kinds of beliefs that enhance hierarchy, right? And just to say something before I dive into the environmental context to help explain this idea of hierarchy enhancing ideas, you might want to think about things like India and think about the caste system. If you think about the caste system in India, that's a system that basically had a belief, a set of beliefs that people who were at the bottom of the society, the Dalits, those who are considered untouchable, were properly at the bottom of the society because they had a bad karma, and that bad karma caused them to be at the bottom of the society. And good karma caused members of that society to be at the top, and they would tend in cases sometimes to be Brahmin, right? And higher caste Brahmin. And so this group identity would be a way that the society would signal where you belonged. And that would justify and legitimate any placements where you might be at the bottom of the society. It would be based on your group identity. So in American context, you might think about the fact that slavery was unlawful to perpetrate against whites. right? And eventually unlawful to perpetrate against anyone but African Americans, right? If you were Native American, if you were Latino, if you proved that identity, you would have to be released from being enslaved. Only African descended people were rightfully enslaved in the United States as a matter of law, because the ideology was that African people initially didn't have souls, and therefore they could not be, they could be enslaved without violating the church's rules. And then it was that African people were so inherently inferior of type that slavery was appropriate and proper for them, right? So you have these ideas in the society that justify and legitimate an inequitable distribution of the societal goods and the societal harm. So we see that playing itself out in the environmental context in a few of these, right? When we deny the reality of the discrimination that has taken place historically in a contemporary context to determine where people find themselves and what they're exposed to, like not talking about redlining, not talking about ongoing racial discrimination in mortgage lending and in housing. We find that people explain environmental disparities in ways that would eliminate racial discrimination as an explanation, as happens in all of these examples. And those kinds of ideas help to maintain and keep hierarchy in place. The second thing that keeps hierarchy in place is the fact that there are certain institutions that replicate hierarchy through their every day-to-day practice, right? So institutions that are hierarchy enhancing are those that distribute more environmental benefits to whites, for example, and fewer environmental benefits to people of color. Hierarchy enhancing institutions are those that help to keep the group-based dominance in the environmental quality in place, right? And so you might want to think about organizations that take a neutral approach or just protect everyone as actually being hierarchy enhancing institutions, because they maintain the status quo, and the status quo is one that was built on structural racism and discrimination, and that status quo keeps, in fact, those disparities in place. One way of thinking about it in environmental context is that we would never try to protect animals or species in a habitat without looking at the different experiences that those species have within that habitat. And yet, when we talk about environmental protection in a context of human beings, the argument is made that we should not pay attention to those very same factors. Lastly, when we see that we have members of institutions that in fact are committed to maintaining neutral policies without regard to their effect, replicate hierarchy because they legitimize the disparities that they are perpetuating. Some examples of these: corporations, land use boards, unfortunately, environmental protection agencies. So we see there is no neutral ground in the context of the social dominance paradigm. You're either going to make environmental decisions that challenge the status quo inequality in your country or in America in our context, or that are going to run counter to it. And so the consequences then of this social dominance that we talk about in the environmental context is that we see these disparities that I talked about earlier in people's experience of the environment, in people's exposure to the harms of climate change, in the level of vulnerability that people have to diseases like COVID-19, and that these things result from an existing structure in the society that is maintained through certain kinds of ideas and institutional practices. The last thing I'll mention with regards to environmental justice is that environmental justice helps us attend to the distribution of benefits and also to the distribution of harms, but it also helps us understand the importance of engagement and participation in the procedures and decision-making, so that the decision-making also is involving the communities that are most affected by environmental decisions, and that thirdly, all communities get equal regard when decisions are being made, so that some communities don't get greater levels of protection because who happens to live in them versus other communities. And so this is necessary if we want to see equity and justice achieved in the environmental sphere. And so the SDGs provide for us a way of thinking about equity and understanding equity and sustainability. And when you pull those two pieces in your pocket that I asked you to put in earlier, they also remind us that we have to be very focused on anti-discrimination in the way we do our environmental protection. And in the United States context, that means being anti-racist in our approach to environmental protection, not just non-racist. Thanks very much, and I look forward to further discussion.
Thank you, Professor Waterhouse. We look forward to Professor and Dr. Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University. Prior to his beginning, I'd like to remind the audience that we will be taking questions and having a discussion at the end. So if you'll kindly use the Q&A feature that is available to you via webinar for that. So we'll take all questions at the end. Thank you, and glad to have you, Dr. Sachs. Please begin.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Professor Waterhouse, Professor Bond, and I'm delighted to be with you. And what a wonderful, amazing presentation we just heard. Absolutely spot on and very powerful and very, very helpful for us to think about how to proceed in a country that is unfair, grotesquely so, and definitely in need of many kinds of healing. And what Professor Waterhouse just told us about was a specific kind of action that is needed for environmental justice, not just good environmental policies, but justice in the context of a history of profound environmental injustice. I'm glad that he referenced the recent book, The Color of Law, by Professor Rothstein, which does make very clear also on the environmental side exactly what Professor Waterhouse was saying and what he has been saying and championing, which is that the fact that African-American people and poor people, but especially on a racial basis, live in environmentally dangerous areas is not a side effect of poverty, though there's an element of that. It's not a mere coincidence or just another dimension of hardship. It is the result of absolutely deliberate, grotesquely racist policies over a long period of time, which did two things. One, pushed African-American people into dangerous places, those that were near factories, toxic waste, and so forth. And then whenever a new facility was to be approved, an incineration plant or a waste dump area, that would be zoned precisely to be in the areas of African Americans, not in white communities. And so this was a conscious policy of environmental inequality and injustice and killer consequences of air and water pollution and ill health and high cancer rates and asthma and many other health disabilities and lethal conditions that has been persistent over centuries. But as we have industrialized, and especially in the post-World War II era, a completely persistent mode of injustice in the United States. Well, our country's filled with injustice, this is for sure. And it is, of course, the most unequal of any high-income country in the world. Unequal by class, unequal by wealth, income, and of course, racial and ethnic disparities as well. And heaven hope that we have the chance to do something about this soon. We not only have the legacy and the current realities of all these injustices, but we certainly have the worst government in American history, in recent history. And we need to do something about this. So I'm thrilled to add a dimension to our discussion, the new report, Never More Urgent, that Professor Bond and her colleague Clarence Luzan and my colleagues Elena Lynch and Caroline Fox and our two colleagues at NCFBI. And I know that we have Earl Hamilton with us on the panel, so I'm excited about that. And also Dr. Harold Ray have contributed to produce a report that examines the Sustainable Development Goals, where we stand, with a resolution by ethnic group and race, which is not normally produced, unfortunately. In fact, it's the kind of information that our government produces less and less of, I'm sorry to say, as part of the deliberate attempts to maintain these inequalities and these injustices. So this wonderful team of colleagues has put together a report to examine the Sustainable Development Goals on a disaggregated basis, with the focus on 5 major areas: justice, the criminal justice system in particular, which is a target of SDG 16, to reduce incarceration and injustices along criminal justice lines, and to ensure equality under the law. Food and housing. This is especially in the SDGs, SDG 2. There's not enough about housing. There's some in SDG 11. And food is treated especially in the SDG 2 to fight hunger. The inequalities and state of SDG performance on education, which is mainly SDG 4. Economic security, which is whether or not people have access to jobs, job security, decent work conditions, largely around SDG 8, and health conditions. Of course, health conditions also related to the environmental conditions that Professor Waterhouse just described to us so vividly. And that's largely around SDG 3. We were not able, in fact, to do enough on the environmental goals themselves, because there's so little, at least publicly available information, or maybe I should say accessible information on the environmental inequalities. There's more, I think, than we know of, and Professor Waterhouse will guide us to some of the data that we have not yet included, but it's not easy to find the nationwide, consistent, publicly available, up-to-date, timely data on the inequalities regarding air pollutants, as Professor Waterhouse described, or safe water and so forth, disaggregated by race and ethnicity. And so this is a big challenge going forward. What does the report show? Well, not surprising, it shows massive inequalities of state of the Sustainable Development Goals for African American communities, for indigenous peoples, for Hispanic populations, for other minority groups. America is a country that has been a white supremacist country from its start, and it is clearly in the record whenever one can find these data that these inequalities persist not only as historical legacies, but as current ways that the economic system continues to operate. And that is an absolutely grim and stunning fact. Of course, the current administration has done everything possible to exacerbate these inequalities. That's the purpose of the Trump administration and his cronies. It is a white supremacist administration. I think it is fair to say, and Trump even campaigns on those lines in a very vulgar way, so I don't think it's a deniable fact. It seems to be even a proud fact. But the policies are to exacerbate the adverse environmental realities of our country. Trump wants to deregulate any pollutant right now under regulation. Of course, Trump has pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement itself. And Trump would leave vulnerable populations near these polluting industries in even more distress, and across the range of social outlays. The goal of the Republican Party longstanding, and Trump in an even more vulgar way, is to cut the taxes of the richest people in the United States. Those are white people, just as an obvious aside, and to then cut the social expenditures on health, education, community development, local infrastructure to the maximum extent that this gang can get away with. They've gotten away with some, they haven't gotten away with anywhere as much as they would like to, and they will keep doing it and keep trying as long as they have the power to do it. I think that the report absolutely emphasizes two things, or maybe three things. One, the Sustainable Development Goals are a powerful roadmap for any society, and I would say especially for a society plagued by these inequalities and discriminatory practices, because the essence of sustainable development is a good life for everybody. The UN slogan is "No one left behind," and I think that that is a very important starting point. The Sustainable Development Goals call for economic well-being, social justice, narrowing inequalities, and environmental sustainability. So the metrics, I believe, and the goals, I believe, are worthy for the US to take on. It's probably for that reason that Trump has never said Sustainable Development Goals. No, those three words, I don't think he's ever uttered in sequence during his presidency. Just one of the many ways that he is the worst president in American history. But I think that the goals are worthy. That's point number one. Point number two, we can use and need more timely data on a disaggregated basis. Some exists. It tells a stark story of a country that is not achieving sustainable development and of great inequalities within our society. So many parts of our population are hurting very, very badly and are especially far from access to the basic rights that are declared in the Sustainable Development Goals. Access to health, SDG 3, access to education, SDG 4, access to decent nutrition, SDG 2, access to a decent job, SDG 8, and so on. And so the data tell a powerful story, but we need We need Professor Waterhouse to help us bring on more environmental data and to work, I hope, in the Biden administration with the Census Bureau to help bring forward a lot more data than we have right now on the detailed structure of sustainable development conditions across our country by community. And of course, the third message of this report is we need dramatically a new set of policies, policies to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. That means by 2030, to achieve breakthroughs in access to healthcare, education, decent nutrition, jobs, and environmental sustainability. It's actually not crazy to think that we could make breakthrough progress even within 10 years, because we are held back not by our lack of resources, we're held back by our politics. And it just may be the case, although I don't want to jinx anything, but it may be the case that we're on the verge of getting these bums out of power and having a chance to do something sane again. Now, let me say, last time, we had with the Obama administration, there were so many roadblocks put in the way, and I think we need to learn the lesson that we're going to need a lot of activist politics and not the kind of self-limiting actions that sometimes might have seemed to be right at some points. We need breakthroughs now. We are way behind because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are now in a state of outright emergency in our country. Of course, Trump is also leaving unbelievable vulnerabilities for our country, and with hugely higher impacts on the African American community and the Hispanic community from the pandemic itself. So we are urgently in need of solutions to stop the pandemic, which can be done, and then to re-employ our population, but in a sustainable way, to overcome the environmental injustices by building back in a clean, progressive, and just manner, to deploy clean, renewable energy, to stop the massive pollutants, to clean up the neighborhoods where people are suffering from water that is dangerous, air pollution that is killer, and the technologies exist. We just have not had the political power to bring this about. Finally, I think Professor Waterhouse is absolutely correct that it's not just a matter looking ahead of fighting poverty or narrowing income inequalities. It is overcoming the structures of racism that are pervasive in the regulatory and the political processes as well. And that also means restitution. And it means retributive justice, in my view. What the color of law that Professor Waterhouse referred to makes clear is that the actions that were taken that put African American communities in harm's way were grotesquely illegal when they were done. And that requires retributive justice, not just to say we won't misbehave anymore, but to make up for past injustices. And I think that there is a lot of work ahead in the courts and in legislation and in mobilizing fiscal revenues for investments for safe, clean, healthy communities that can play an important role. Let me just tell you, I looked it up just moments ago. As of this morning, to give you an idea of where we could get some resources, 4 Americans, 4 people, the richest 4, Jeffrey Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and Elon Musk, have just 4 people wealth of $538 billion in their financial accounts as of today. $538 billion. It's time that rich people pay a wealth tax. It's time that we mobilize these vast resources that our country has so that 4 people can't have more wealth than 100 million Americans do. We need to create a society of justice. I believe the Sustainable Development Goals can help us to do it. And I want to thank all of you for being leaders in that effort. It's really a profound privilege for me to have a chance to share these thoughts with you.
Thank you, Dr. Sachs, for that. We appreciate that very much. I want to continue to encourage people to send in your questions via the Q&A. I, as the moderator, will read those off, and so we will attend to them. I do see a few in the chat area, but primarily the Q&A. Our next speaker is Mr. Earl Hamilton. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bond. First of all, I want to give kudos to my fellow panelists and the incredible information that's actually being shared. Dr. Bond, you can start that PowerPoint whenever you're ready. And the incredible information that's actually being shared. But I also want to take a moment to congratulate Howard University on its homecoming. And you guys are doing an incredible job with everything, even in the midst of this pandemic and everything that's actually happening. It's absolutely amazing. So kudos to President Frederick, to the provost, to all the administrators, to all the students, to all of you who are actively engaged in what's actually happening with this homecoming. Extraordinarily proud and happy to be a part of this. And the National Center is very, very proud just to be a part of everything that's happening here. And I want to encourage anyone. I've been able to attend several of these sessions, it's just incredible information that we're taking. So the question comes to us is we're getting all this incredible detail, and Dr. Waterhouse gave us some incredible information, and Dr. Sachs has given us incredible information. I love the way that Dr. Waterhouse put it. He talked about that now we're given the information and that we know and the data and the reporting. Now, how do we become a part of the decision-making process? Or Dr. Sachs actually called it, said, how do we now become activists in the policy and political process? So I want to talk about that and talk about exactly where you, if you're attending the session, how do you fit and how do we work together and moving this work forward? And I love, because that's the conversation that's actually been coming out of each and every one of these sessions. And I want to talk a bit about the National Center and who we are and how we've gotten to this point. Next slide, please. So the National Center is actually an intermediary organization. Our sweet spot is we create strong coalitions of grassroots organizations, institutions either of higher learning or of social service, and government agencies. And what we specialize in and what we endeavor to do is to create tailored place-based strategies within local communities to improve the quality of lives of their constituency. We're also a technical assistance provider. We also do, as is with this report, we believe in creating best practices and advocating for policy that is data informed and is based on good research. And so we do this from a faith-based perspective, but we also recognize that we leverage the power of faith-based organizations. Even back in the civil rights era, it was the faith-based organizations that were the natural connectivity. They were the natural nexus to the need in urban communities. They were the ones where there was information dissemination. They are the nexus where there's social service provision. And they're also the one who typically has the strong heart and pulse of the community, because they're providing for the community on both the social services as well as for their spiritual needs, whatever that faith may be. It's a powerful leverage to use strong faith-based institutions and grassroots agencies to actually take this type of information and push this work forward. We believe at the National Center, and you'll hear it in almost anything we say. Dr. King has this incredible quote that says, "Any religion that professes to be concerned with the souls of men, but is not equally concerned with the slums that damn them, the economic conditions that strangle them, and the social conditions that cripple them, is a dry as dust religion." And this is really kind of the marching call that we actually have when we pull these coalitions together and the work that we actually do. Next slide, please. So in really late 2018 and early 2019, there was strong rhetoric that was actually in our political and cultural sphere regarding everything from immigration, from the disaggregation of people of color. There was a lot of negative things, and I think that everybody knows where that was actually in the media regarding how this country was viewing and then operationalizing its views toward African Americans, brown people, immigrants, and indigenous populations. So the United Center pulled together a coalition of national leaders, of organizations, of organizational leaders, of individuals, of stakeholders in various communities out the country, across the country, and we engaged in a conversation on a larger level. And we just wanted to answer one specific question: what are the 5 top maladies that are disproportionately impacting people of color, immigrant population, and indigenous peoples? And surprisingly enough, as we went through this exercise and we went through multiple listening sessions and we found different perspectives from different geographies throughout the country, we actually found that the opinion on what the top maladies are, although there was some consensus, was varied across a spectrum of people's age, experiences, economic status, and as well as what they actually saw even in the political realm. So we wanted to get an answer to this so that we can actually identify where were the sweet spots, where were the areas where we as a people could come together and actually start having an impact. Next slide, please. So in lieu of dealing with this, the National Center in early February, and this was actually pre-COVID, even the George Floyd incident, we actually commissioned a report. And we asked for, we wanted some specific information out of this report. We wanted from a non-subjective empirical standpoint to understand and identify what are the top disparity issues of disproportionately affecting African Americans, people, and African Americans, indigenous populations, and Hispanic populations. We wanted the data to have a strong cross-sectionality from public, private, and institutional sources. It was very, very important. We wanted to look at this data from a strength-based perspective, not only identifying what the needs were, but also identifying what the potential resources are that can actually be leveraged to actually change the tide of what was actually happening. And then the strongest point that actually came out, even in the midst of this, that several people have already discussed, is now we are identifying extreme gaps in data and service from many providers that are absolutely critical in being able to identify and to unwind the invisibility of ethnicities and cultures within our society. And what do I mean by that? All of you who may have attended the session on yesterday, Dr. Bond did incredible, and Dr. Lusane, and of course Elena, did incredible work on actually showing how there's restrictive data relative across race and ethnicity groups, across all spectrums of reporting. But that restrictive data, or that missing data, also goes to the invisibility of specific cultures. It also goes to the lack of attention for indigenous populations, which is one of the hardest things to get. It also does not take into account and respect the humanity and the fullness of humanity of minority populations within the United States. So identifying those gaps in service has actually been elevated as a core piece of what we're looking to do. And then on an internal standpoint at the National Center, we were actually looking to take this data and also identify the historical correlations, the human decision makings, and the policies that created these maladies. Why is that important? The data tells us where we are. It tells us the exact condition of our country and where we are as it concerns providing services or equity for Black, Brown, and Indigenous populations. But what's also important, if we're going to unwind that, if we're going to unpack that and focus our work on creating policies to correct those maladies, is we have to know where they came from. And Dr. Waterhouse pointed out some strong things that actually came out also in our reporting, everything from redlining, everything from group-based dynamics, institutional segregation. All of these are systemic issues that still exist today, even as Dr. Sachs was saying, still exist and are alive and well in our policymaking and decision-making. Next slide, please. So we commissioned this study. We brought together some select groups. We have incredible data partners with Howard University. Dr. Lucene and Dr. Bond, who's actually with us now, have been incredible partners in this work. And also the Sustainable Development Solutions Network out of the United Nations have been incredible partners in looking at cross-sectional data from a very non-subjective point of view. And we were very, very key on making sure that our own biases weren't actually impacting this data. And so these three organizations came together to actually form this report, the Never More Urgent report, and we're excited about that. So now that we have this data, now that we have this report, next slide. Now that we have this, we're looking at, the National Center is looking at how do we now move this work forward? How do we, even as this conference talks about, how do we move from protest to policy? How do we galvanize the incredible energy that we're actually seeing on the streets of our cities today in response to what's, to the tragic killing of George Floyd and others? How do we now galvanize that incredible energy and put that into a movement at this extremely, extremely strong inflection point in our country? We have a very, very rare opportunity to change the face and to change the dynamic of how minority individuals, how disenfranchised individuals are treated and are viewed and are dehumanized within this country. So we have this report now which demonstrates the problem. Our next step, and this is where all of you who are on the line and all those who are in your spheres of influence actually come into play. We are going to be working with individuals across every sphere of politics, every sphere of religion, every sphere of academia, so that we can actually come together and we can actually develop grassroots solutions and policies, not only on the federal level, but also on the local level of how do we actually change this, stem the tide and empower individuals on the ground to actually make that systemic change. How do we engage those soldiers on the ground, and like what Dr. Waterhouse said, in being fully engaged and informed in the decision-making process? How do we activate, even as Dr. Sachs says, the activists who will actually be marching forward with policy, and how do we move that forward? And then third, once we actually have developed those transcendent policies, that is when we actually speak to the powers that be and we actually demand a response. It's been said a lot, especially in the African-American community. There's a large feeling of we get absolutely nothing for our vote. During these election years, we're actually courted, we're actually mobilized and galvanized around different hierarchies of thought. But at the end of the day, our community is not seeing any real systemic or institutional change relative to our economics. I think that day has changed, and I think that day is over. I think that as a people, we need to come together in such a manner that we can demand, we can exercise our power, we can exercise this movement, and we can put a demand on the powers that be, or change the powers that be, to make sure that our voices are heard and that policies are actually put forth. Dr. Waterhouse made a powerful, powerful statement yesterday, and he actually reiterated that today. And that statement was this: it was raising the bottom through social service and alleviation of the human condition. Raising the bottom and actually assisting people does not equal, or is not equate to equity. So even with the sustainability issues and things that we're looking to address, that still does not necessarily equal equity. That does not mean a seat at the table. That does not mean where our views are humanized and are valued and are taken into account in decision making and things that are actually happening in our community. That is what we're looking to change, and that is why we believe we have a rare opportunity now in this time, 2020, to actually change that. Next slide, please. So what is the role of the National Center, and more importantly, what is your role if you're actually on the line and you're seeing this presentation? If you've come to this session, if you come to any of these sessions, obviously you're here because you have a like-mindedness in recognizing that everything in our country is not as it should be, and that you recognize that you have the power within you to change your local environment, as well as have an impact on a larger level on the lives of people. So the next steps that the National Centers would like to do is we want you to become a part of this conversation. We want you to become a part of this solution. Our marching orders are very, very simple. We're going to take the information, this policy, we're going to take the information that is within this report. That report is going to be expanded, and we're looking for partners to come in to give additional data, like Dr. Sachs said, so that we can actually look and start looking at equity. We can start looking at equity. We can start looking at environmental justice, so we can start identifying natural areas of need. So out of that, the National Centers will bring together a team, and we're going to start developing and drafting policy on a federal level. We're going to start unpacking some of these disparities that are actually within the study. How do we start looking at what the correlations are on how did we get here, and now how do we make it better? We're going to be having some listening sessions with individuals, organizations, institutions. That means you who's actually on this line. That means those that are in the sphere of influence. We want you to be a part of this conversation, and we want to keep you fully informed on where we are in this progress. All right, we want your buy-in. This is not one individual's idea of putting together any kind of a platform, but this is a collective grassroots movement where we're pushing for policy to impact our people. We'll be doing this through town hall presentations. We'll be always keeping you informed and giving information through our website. And the most important piece is advocacy. We intend to fight once we have these policies until these policies become law. We will use every every avenue to of our power. We will use faith-based organizations. We're looking for allies, advocates, all who can buy into this, and we will push these until these become law. And here's the real power also of the reporting, and I think that has been lacking in some of the policy invectives that have gone before. SDSN and also Howard University have assisted us in taking the data within this report and also developing a report card. This report card will allow us to do quarterly reporting on how any administration and agencies are performing relative to the rubric and the predetermined metrics that come out of that report. I.e., we won't just have, we won't allow any politicians to just give us lip service in saying what they'll do for us. We're going to report out to the constituency, to all those that were a part of this process. This is how this administration is actually performing relative to that, and we'll be giving them a grade. And based on that, we'll be looking to mobilize each and every one of you to make sure that even on the local level, that that these SDG goals are actually moving forward and that we're actually seeing massive improvement with our communities. Next slide, please. So how do we do that? How do we do that? I'm going to ask that you simply go to our website, which is ncfbi.org, register there. We will be in consistent contact as we're moving this work forward. And we're looking for you to become a part of this conversation. We're looking, as this conference talks about, of moving from the strength and the organic feeling of this protest to move into how do we now move into this arena of policy. This is an area where you can become involved, where we need your voice, and we're looking forward to actually working with you. You are absolutely valued and appreciated in all the work you do. And I want to appreciate Howard University and all the HBCUs. And everyone who's actually worked on this project specifically. And I invite you to become a part of everything that we're going to be doing. So thank you so much. Dr. Bond?
Thank you so much for your presentations. We do have a few minutes left for questions, so I'm going to bundle some of those questions and offer them to any one of you that would like to respond. Our first question is, should Black people and people of color work within the present societal structures or perhaps build their own? Let me bundle that with the second question, if you would. Are the SDGs compatible with neoliberal capitalism? Who would ever like to take either one of those? Thank you.
I've actually responded to the first one in the chat.
Okay.
And I'll just emphasize for others that I think Derek Bell attempts to address this in his book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well. And what I take from that is the importance of deciding what the ideal would look like if you were able to create your perfect society that is going to be free of racism, for example. What would that include? What would that require? And then to use that in whatever institution you find yourself in. If you're in an HBCU, what should that institution look like? If you're in an institution that does not have a predominantly racial or ethnic identity, what should that look like? If you're an institution that has predominantly white racial identity, what should that look like? So in some ways, I think Derek Bell helps us to see that first you need to figure out what the ideal is. And then from there, whatever institution you're building, you need to make sure that those ideals are embedded in what you're working for. The neoliberal question in SDGs, I'm going to have to pass on to the economists of the hour.
Dr. Sachs and Mr. Hamilton.
Dr. Sachs.
Sorry about that. Even though we're 6 months of doing nothing but Zoom, I'm always on mute. So let me say that I think I'm going to revert, first of all, to Martin Luther King Jr. also about the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. You know, American society is changing, and we are watching the worst of the rear guard right now. In my view, and Trump is, he's a psychopath in my opinion, but in any event, he's the worst we have. But it's kind of grasping to hold on to the most reactionary part of the country when society is changing. And the way that they can do it now is age-old ways that they're trying, voter suppression, you know, the ancient way that you can't let democracy function properly. I don't think he'll get away with it, but they're clearly trying it state by state. Of course, they cling to small states having oversized say, because that's how the Constitution was designed, not coincidentally, as a way to build some of this outlandish power structure. But you look at young people, I think across the races, on the whole, the younger generation is much more tolerant, much more experienced in living in diversity. Of course, we're becoming a much more diverse society. So I think trends will go in the right direction, though I can't wait to get rid of this guy myself. And I hope we're just weeks away. And in this sense, you know, let's get out the vote right now, make sure it's counted, defend the vote. And then I think there will be a real shot at a new kind of policy next year if the good things happen in the next few weeks, because it relates to the second question about neoliberalism. The US is an outlier of all of the high-income democracies in the world. Of course, we're an outlier because of our history of racial injustice, because of the lack of class solidarity and the whole history of the United States being different. But we don't have the basics that other countries have of universal access to healthcare, of vacation time for everybody, of family leave time, for heaven's sake, of sick leave time. This is normal in every country except our weird country. So I spend a lot of time putting the US in comparison with Canada and the countries of Europe. And we're the only one that doesn't have the most basic things. Everyone has health coverage in every other rich country. Everyone has family leave. Everyone has sick leave. You know, everyone is vacation time, by the way, guaranteed by the government as a part of basic employment terms. So I keep having the idea that the United States could become normal. You know, we don't have to be this weird one outlier country. We could become normal. And if we became normal, we would start to see a lot of decency and progress. And we know the structural factors that have held us back, and we know the history of the past 40 years. We've been on a neoliberal jag since Reagan took office in January 1981. And actually, no president has really changed that path. And Trump, I believe, historically will look like the last of the last guard of the reactionary approach. And I want to see 2021, therefore, as a change of direction of the United States that is really a significant change over the next 20 or 30 years, so that we become a lot more social democratic, a lot less neoliberal, and taking care of the needs of people so that we're achieving sustainable development. I think it's possible. And a market economy is not the same as neoliberalism. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, they're market economies, but they don't look anything like us, not even Canada, you know, just our northern neighbor. And so we should aspire to normalcy, decency, and that will be a huge improvement for us.
Thank you. I'll just sort of maybe condense this next question. Thank you for that, Dr. Sachs. We'll go on to the next question. A repost from the chat. While I've encountered Black people, although they do not support Trump, they're happy to see him reverse Obama's environmental policies because of the impacts to the industries in which they work. Thank you for drawing connections made today. I did not understand the implications that such policies had for Black people and other people of color. It would be great to know what additional readings you recommend. We can certainly recommend you the report, Never More Urgent, that will be made available in various places. Another question, I'll just lump that in with the last one. Given that in the entirety of transforming our world, the SDGs only mention one aspect of indigenous communities, relationships to their environment, i.e. SDG 12.8, how can we even consider the SDGs as a non-neutral roadmap, given its reliance on Occidental assumptions of economic development as successful modes of living? Generally speaking, I can't help but wonder, how are the SDGs any less an example of white supremacy? There's two really big questions there. Would anyone like to shed light on sort of questioning the maybe legitimacy a bit of the SDGs I see in that question?
I would.
Okay, thank you.
Because I don't agree with that at all, by the way. What the SDGs are actually is trying, again, in our generation, to implement the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's the moral charter that the world has agreed to back in 1948, 72 years ago. And the moral charter of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that everybody on this planet has human dignity. And as a result of that, everybody on this planet has the right to health, to education, to social protection, to the means to care for families. And also, this was instantiated in the 1960s with social, cultural, and economic covenants that went along with the Universal Declaration, talking about preservation of culture and of peoples. So what the SDGs is not a structure of Western domination. Believe me, would never have had the SDGs if it were that, because the US would, it's barely part of this story. This is a story of universal rights and universal dignity. And we should see it that way, and we should build it that way. And it's really vital that we have that universality. I know, because I've been a special advisor to the Secretary General of the UN for Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon and Antonio Guterres, I have spent a lot of time with indigenous communities around the world. There are about 400 million people from indigenous communities that participate in the UN processes. They want the Sustainable Development Goals. Believe me, they're using them as instruments of justice within their society. They're not saying, no, no, stay away. They're saying, help us. You know, we're so abused that the SDGs are a hope of common human dignity. So I don't view it that way. I view it as something universal. And I take the great strength of the SDGs precisely to be that they're agreed by all 193 countries of the world. I was very gratified that the day they were agreed, Pope Francis opened the UN General Assembly that day and spoke in universal moral terms for this kind of what he called a common plan for our common home. And I believe that that's what the SDGs represent.
Okay, great. One last question. How does the average layman break through the liberal or conservative views in order to arrive at the truth of policies and their impact on communities of color?
Can I jump in real quick?
Sure.
It's partially to respond to the first part of the question, of the last question you asked about where people can read more. And what I did in that was to answer that specifically to that person in the chat. So if that person looks in the chat, I answered them specifically. I suggested some books that are out there on environmental justice by Dr. Robert Bullard, as well as Toxic Waste and Race at 20, as well as some other references. I would recommend those to anyone who wants to learn more about environmental justice, as well as Toxic Communities by Dorsett Taylor. Good books on environmental justice to understand it better. I would also note that a number of studies, and this is to answer that question, a number of studies have come out in support by the Environmental Protection Agency itself with regards to disparities and people of color to certain pollution, particularly in the context of air. The American Lung Association, you can look at the issued. You can also look at studies that have been done by researchers at various universities. And so I think this idea of a dichotomy of liberal and conservative is really a matter of spin. I think you're going to find when you find researchers doing this kind of work is people looking at the data and trying to pull out the evidence to make sense of what's going on in the world. And if making sense of that runs counter to what are your personal economic and political interests, then you may spin that data or discredit that data. And that's where I think the liberal and conservative kind of comes in. But I don't think, for the most part, people doing empirical research around health disparities are representing a liberal or conservative view. They're just trying to help us understand the phenomenon that we're experiencing in the world.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to tie in on that just a bit too. And I love Dr. Waterhouse, the point you were just saying. And I think if you're speaking from a layman's perspective of how do we get involved, if you're like most of us in the country, if we look at the platform of either party right now, if you're a person of color, you don't see yourself in that platform. We can try to, almost like you said, we can try to be spun into the platform of economics in certain ways. But I don't know about you, but I don't necessarily see my need, my community, my people directly being addressed in that platform in a way with a specificity that I think that, number one, our vote and our power deserve, and also our humanness actually being embraced in that. And I believe that's a part of what this process is. I love what Dr. Waterhouse talked about is researchers and all that aren't looking at this from any type of a partisan perspective. And so when we start pairing researchers with the grassroots individuals who are working on the ground, who are doing this work, and also pairing with the organizations, those community leaders, individuals just like you, when you're saying a layman on the ground, how do we now actually come into this dynamic conversation of what is our elemental need? How do we look at what our elemental needs and have a consensus on that, and then use our power to push that work forward to become the platform of whoever's actually going to be in power, to put pressure and leverage the same way that other advocacy groups do for their whatever their policies are. So my simple answer to be with that is I don't see how we actually work in concert necessarily with what is being put forth by either administration. And until we as a people put forth our own plans and stand behind those, we won't see substantive change that we're looking for in our communities. We're not looking for someone else to actually do it for us. We want to put forth our own plans and agenda and then put that forth to make it happen on our own and for ourselves. So.
Well said, Earl. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Mr. Hamilton, Dr. Sachs, and Professor Waterhouse, and we're ending our session. We hope you gained a lot from it. And as many of us said today, please do get out to vote. So thank you very much, and we're signing off. Have a good day.
Great. Thank you to everybody. Fantastic session. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.